I found myself thinking this week about tombstones and the things that we write on them. It's so poignant to see an entire life summarized in a few words. Some can be funny. For example, Rodney Dangerfield, the comedian famous for his line, "I can't get no respect," put on his tombstone, "There goes the neighborhood." And Merv Griffith, the famous late night talk show host, inscribed on his headstone, "I will not be back after this message." Then there's a man buried in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, whose life was summed up with this: "Here lies the body of Jonathan Blake. He stepped on the gas instead of the brake." Particularly astute, though, are the words on this grave: "Here lies an atheist, all dressed up and nowhere to go." More often, the words are brief and tender: "Loving mother and beloved wife," or "Loving husband of 52 years. Among my favorites is one I saw recently, which said simply, "Pat Smith, a child of God." It wasn't Halloween that got me thinking about all this. It was today's epistle, the second letter to Timothy. These are the words that caught my attention. "I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all who have longed for his appearing." These sound to me like the words of a man at the end of his life, a man reflecting back on the years he has lived while also looking forward to what he expects to come in the life to come. He's telling us how he hopes to be remembered. He's telling us, too, what he now has to look forward to. I think he does a fine job with both. They're beautiful thoughts. How wonderful to be able to say at the end of your life, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I've kept the faith." I'd love to be able to say this myself in my final moment. I hope I can. This thought led me to reflect on last words in general. By that, I don't mean so much the words themselves, but how we approach our end and what we hope others will say to us. It was then that I started to think about tombstones. That reminded me once again of my mother's passing. My mother was the fifth of 5 children. She was born in 1928, the year before the Great Depression, to a farm family living about 40 miles south of Philadelphia. They were part of a community of Swiss immigrants who had arrived in the early 1800s to escape religious persecution. She grew up in an extremely close-knit community, much like the Amish. But unlike the Amish, they used machines. They had tractors, and a few even had automobiles. But all the men had long beards and dark clothes, and all the women had long dresses and head coverings. They all took care of each other, though. Much of the time, this was a good thing. But sometimes it could be intrusive. For example, when my mother was 6 months old, her father, still a young man, collapsed and died of a heat stroke one afternoon after a long day under the scorching August sun. As a result, though, the community rallied and began to pressure my grandmother to divide up her children among other families so that they could be taken care of. Determined to keep them together, my grandmother made a desperate choice. She married a man against her better judgment. The result was the family did stay together, but at a terrible price. The man turned out to be deeply troubled, as my grandmother had suspected, both violent and abusive. He died before I was born, and no one ever spoke of him again. They did allude occasionally to the scars he left, though. That meant, however, that my mother grew up longing for the father she had never known. The man who had, by all reports, been warm, gentle, and loving. Although my mother had no actual memories of him, she told me often how much she thought of him as a girl, how she'd sometimes cried herself to sleep with the ache of his absence. At the time, I wondered why she would experience such grief for someone she herself had no memory of. It was only later that I realized that the true cause of her anguish was her dread of her stepfather. It was because of him that she had spent much of her childhood aching to have her real father back again. All her life, she continued to feel this loss, the loss of a father she knew only from a single photograph. When my mother died, we held her funeral in the little church near the farm where she grew up, the church where she and my father had been married, and where my father was now buried, and where my father was also now buried in the small cemetery beside the church. After we laid her to rest in the grave beside my father, I began to look around the cemetery. I knew that many of my mother's relatives were buried there, and I decided to see if I could find her father's grave, her true father's grave. I studied tombstone after tombstone. All had names and dates and a few words of remembrance. Many were very old and hard to read, though. I came across my grandmother, Catherine Tyson, it said, wife, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, beloved by all. Finally, after looking over most of the ground and finding no trace of my grandfather, the grandfather I never knew, I looked back at my mother's grave and noticed that there was one small tombstone just on the other side of my mother's grave, which had been covered by some plywood to prevent it from being buried by the mound of dirt that would be used to fill my mother's grave after we were all gone. I went over and carefully lifted the wood covering. I read the name underneath. There it was. There was her father's grave, her true father's grave. He was buried just on the other side of my mother, so that she now lay between her husband on the one side and her father on the other. I assumed that she must have known this, but maybe not. The stone was worn and very difficult to read. Maybe it was just a coincidence that her body would now rest between, on the one hand, the man whose absence had left her childhood so empty and painful, and on the other, the man whose presence had made her life as an adult so full and bright. I bent down closer to try to make out the words on her father's gravestone. The stone was the stone of the grandfather I never knew. It was Isaiah Tyson, beloved husband, beloved father. In time, I also found her stepfather's grave too. It stood alone, off by itself. It had his name and date. There was nothing else written. It seems strange that in the end, a life is reduced to this, a few words, or in some cases, no words at all. And yet, of course, that can never be all that a life is. Each life is an entire world, and it affects an entire world. I am who I am because of both the people who came before me and the people with me now. Both the people I love and those who have loved me in turn. They formed me and made me who I am. I hope that I was able to touch them, touch their lives too. How hard it is to put all that in a single phrase, though. In my case, I don't intend to. I've already told Sandra that I want to be cremated and have my ashes scattered in the ocean. I won't have an epitaph. And yet I find it helpful to think about what I would have liked it to be. What I'd like people to say about me when I'm gone. I think if I had a choice, it would be this. Ernie Boyer, a child of God. He loved and was loved. For me, that says it all. As far as I'm concerned, that's what life is all about. It's why we are here on earth. We're here to learn three things. We're here to learn first that we are all children of God. Beyond that, though, we are here to learn how to love and how to be loved in return. That's the purpose of life as I see it. How about you? Why are you here? How would you like to be remembered? What do you hope that others will say about you when you're gone? Why don't you think about it in the week ahead? After all, it's good to know what we're working toward. That way, we're more likely to achieve it. And as the letter of Timothy shows, when our time comes, it's good to know that we made it. Amen.